Hello, everyone. This is the 37th episode of the Soccernostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles, and I am joined by Paul from Shipley in England. For this episode, we interview Brazilian journalist Mr. José Inácio Werneck as we discuss the Brazil national team of the 1958 World Cup. Mr. Werneck is a journalist, lawyer, interpreter, translator, writer, and a triathlete.
Hello, how are you?
Hi.
Maybe my greatest claim to fame is being a triathlete in my age group.
Well, that is impressive.
Over 83.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. Thank you very much for joining us. Just as an introduction, could you tell us about your early football memories and your involvement in the game since?
Well, my early football memories go back to the 1950 World Cup in Brazil. I actually went to a couple of games. I went to see Brazil and Spain, Brazil and Sweden. I also saw England. They lost the game. My goodness, was it Chile? Anyway, England had a disgraceful tour of Brazil in that World Cup. And they lost to the United States famously in Belo Horizonte, were knocked out by the Americans. But and Brazil was doing very well. They beat Spain and Sweden very easily, 7-1 and 6-1. But eventually, as you know, everybody knows, they lost to Uruguay at the famous Maracanazo in Rio de Janeiro. And so these are my earliest memories. Then the 1954 World Cup, I also followed by radio, no television at that time. And 1958 World Cup also by radio, but with the added, point that they would have television. They already had television, but they didn't broadcast the World Cup from Sweden. But what they would do, you would switch on the television and they would put pictures of the players and you would be listening to the radio going on about the Garrincha and Pelé, and they would put a picture of Garrincha or Pelé, so you would be rooting and listening to the radio. That's how it was in 1958.
Brazil is synonymous with football and the World Cup. Yet it took until 1958, almost 30 years after the start of the World Cup, for Brazil to win its first Jules Rimet trophy. And once it did, the green and gold kits became the standard of football excellence. And they won 3 of the next 4, 1958, 1962, and 1970, with Pelé at the forefront. 1958 was the start of the Brazil football revolution, certainly at international level, despite getting close in 1950. Brazil's football history is not only Pelé, but also to many of this 1958 squad, such as Garrincha, Zagallo, Didi, Vava, Gilmar, Djalma Santos, and Nilton Santos, just to name a few. In fact, the 1962 squad was virtually the same as the 1958 squad. Though the 1970 squad is universally considered the best in football history, this 1958 squad is just as impressive and can lay claim to that title. Mr. José Inácio Werneck has seen it and covered it all, and is in a unique position to walk us through as we take a closer look at that team of 1958. To start off, Brazil had qualified a full year ahead of the finals, as they had eliminated Peru on April 1957 after home and away series. It had been 1-1 tie at Lima and a 1-0 win at Maracana with Didi's famous free kick. As far as Pelé, he would first get capped as a 16-year-old in July 1957 in a couple of Copa Roca matches versus Argentina. And naturally, he scored in both matches.
I was going to say that I was very lucky to have, by chance, witnessed Pelé's first game for Brazil, because I had gone to the beach at the time. That day, it was a Sunday at Ipanema Beach. And after the beach, going to the beach, we were sitting at a bar, a famous bar that was made famous years later by the fact that the famous song, The Girl from Ipanema, was written in that bar. It was a bar called Veloso, and Tom Jobim and Vinicius de Moraes. Vinicius is the poet and diplomat, and Tom Jobim, a well-known musician and maestro. They used to go there to drink chopp, which is draft lager, after going to the beach. And they would see this girl going down the street, going towards the beach. And so they wrote the famous song, well, nice, and going towards the beach, the girl from Ipanema and all that. And I was sitting there, and a friend of mine said, would you like to go? There is a game at Maracanã. I didn't have a car at the time. I was 21 years old. I was a student of law. And I said, yeah, why not? So I took a lift with him. I went to Maracanã. And Pelé came on as a substitute for Del Vecchio. Brazil lost the game 2-1, and he scored the Brazil goal. And 3 days later, Brazil again played Argentina. It was possible to have substitution, not for the World Cup, but for other tournaments like that was the Copa Roca. You could have substitutions. In the second game, 3 days later, he came on from the beginning, and he scored both goals. And Brazil won 2-0 and won the Copa Roca. And famously in that game, Del Vecchio also came on as a sub in the second half, but not for Pelé. Pelé played the whole game. And it was the first 2 games that he played, of a glorified career. Everybody knows the rest of the story. And I was fortunate to, by chance, have seen him playing that first game for Brazil.
You witness history.
Yeah, exactly.
Starting in May 1958, Brazil started its preparations with a series of friendlies, starting in South America with a couple of matches versus Paraguay, and then a couple of matches against Bulgaria. And then they jetted off to Europe and played a couple of matches against Italian clubs, Internazionale and Fiorentina. The side were to be managed by Vicente Feola, although it was Osvaldo Brandão that had achieved the qualification. Let's take a look at Brazil's 22-man squad for the World Cup. At number 1, you had backup goalkeeper Carlos José de Castillo of Fluminense of Rio. At number 2, Hideraldo Bellini, the captain of the team from Vasco da Gama, central defender. Number 3, starting goalkeeper Gilmar of Corinthians Sao Paulo. Number 4, Jalma Santos of Portuguesa Sao Paulo. Number 5, Dino Sani of Sao Paulo. Number 6, Didi of Botafogo of Rio, who would later join Real Madrid but be frozen out by Di Stefano. But that's another story. Number 7, my Zagallo. Everyone needs no introduction, from Flamengo. Number 8, Oreco from Corinthians. Number 9, Zozimo of Bangu of Rio de Janeiro. Number 10, Edson Arantes do Nascimento, Pele of Santos. Number 11, on the right wing, Garrincha of Botafogo of Rio. Number 12, left back, Nilton Santos of Botafogo of Rio. Number 13, Moacir of Flamengo of Rio. Number 14, right back, Nilton de Sordi of Sao Paulo. Number 15, Orlando Pechania of Vasco da Gama. Number 16, Mauro of Sao Paulo. Number 17, Joel of Flamengo. Number 18, José Altafini Mazzola of Palmeiras. Number 19, Zito of Santos. Number 20, Vava of Vasco da Gama of Rio. Number 21, Dida of Flamengo. And number 22, Pepe of Santos.
May I say something about that? It is interesting. You have mentioned all the players and the numbers, and maybe you noticed that the numbers don't really adjust to the position of the players, because, for instance, Garrincha was given number 11, like an outside left, and Zagallo was given number 7. What happened is that the CBF, the Brazilian Federation, was so disorganized at that time that they didn't even have a representative when the numbers were assigned to the players by FIFA. So there was an Uruguayan journalist there, and they asked him if he knew about the Brazilian player. He said yes, and totally by chance, he gave Pelé number 10, and then it became famous as Pelé's number. Wow. It was totally by chance that Pelé had number 10 for that World Cup, because Garrincha, for instance, was number 11, and Zagallo was number 7. and Zózimo was number 9, something
Wow.
like that.
And Gilmar was number 3.
Yeah,
right.
so you see, yeah.
Wow. So that's how he got the famous number 10 jersey. That's amazing.
Yeah, exactly.
That squad's made up of, I think, 12 players from Rio clubs and 10 from Sao Paulo. Is that because there's a tradition of conflict between the federations, the Rio and Sao Paulo? Is that part of a conflict that they almost arrived at almost equal numbers to pick the squad at that time?
Yeah, in a way. Also, what happened is that at that time, Brazilian football was almost totally centered in Rio and São Paulo. That was, a long time ago. There was no Brazilian championship as they have now, a national championship. So there were 2 main footballing centers in Brazil, Rio and São Paulo, and maybe in third place, Porto Alegre in Rio Grande do Sul. But the 2 most important ones were Rio and São Paulo. And also what happened at the time, I don't know whether you know this story, the famous story that when Brazil lost to Uruguay, a Brazilian journalist called Nelson Rodrigues came up with a theory that the Brazilians didn't have the personality to win important tournaments like the World Cup, especially if they were playing against white players, because many Brazilian players were not white. And so he developed this theory that the Brazilian team had alma de vira-lata, which means the soul of a mongrel, a mongrel dog, a kind of dog that goes around like trying to eat food out of trash bins. And that was Brazil. Brazilian players were like that. So it's not quite certain, it's something that has never been proven, but there was at the time, and there still is, a very strong suspicion that CBF tried to make a white team for Brazil to play in Sweden. If you look at the players that began playing, you'll notice, for instance, that the right fullback was De Sorge, not Djalma Santos. And also very interesting, 4 or 5 players of the Brazilian team were Italian Americans. São Paulo has always been a very important center of Italian immigration in Brazil. They are called oriundi, players who are born in Brazil, of Italian immigrants. They have the right to go and play in Italy, like Altafini, who in Brazil was known as Mazzola. Mazzola was the nickname because Mazzola, of course, Sandrino Mazzola was a famous Italian player, so people in Brazil called him Mazzola. For Italy, for the Italians, he was Altafini. He went on to play for AC Milan, and he was known as Altafini. So you had De Sorge. In midfield, you had Gino Sani. Then you had José Altafini. Who else was there of Italian origin? Well, Del Vecchio was not playing at the time, but many players had Italian origin from São Paulo, and the rest of the players were from Rio de Janeiro. Even the coach at that time was Italian Brazilian, Vicente Feola. In Italy, he would be called Vicente Feola. He was the Brazilian coach. Only in the last game, the Djalma Santos, the black right fullback, considered even today maybe one of the best ever in that position, came on for Brazil. All the other games were, with De Sorge playing as right fullback.
Yes, that was something that also stuck out for me, that he only played in a final, and obviously he's considered one of the best right backs in Brazilian history.
And Bellini, talking about the Italian-Brazilian player. Of course, and the captain of the team was Bellini, also another Italian-Brazilian playing for Brazil at that time.
I have read this in a book that for the 1958 World Cup, the Brazilian national team had a psychologist named Dr. João Carvalhais as part of its staff. He had asked each player to draw a human figure, and based upon the results of his test, he would recommend which players should be selected and which players would not be suitable. For instance, if someone drew a poor drawing, the player should be confined to the wings, let's say. According to this legend, Pelé and Garrincha's drawings were so poor that he recommended that they should not play at all. Is this a true story?
I don't know about Pelé, but it is a true story about Garrincha. That is one of the famous stories in Brazilian football. He considered Garrincha to be a half-wit, to be mentally deficient. And he strongly suggested to Vicente Fiola not to play Garrincha. There was also a famous game just before they went to Sweden. You mentioned that Brazil went to play against Fiorentina and against, Inter Milan. I think it was against Fiorentina that Brazil won both of these games 4-0. And in the Fiorentina game, Garrincha scored a goal after dribbling everybody and the goalkeeper, and then he comes back and then he dribbles the goalkeeper again. Even though people thought that was a wonderful skill, that would give, credence to Dr. Carvalhai's theory that he was mentally a little kind of strange. Why would someone do that in a game? Go past the goalkeeper, then come back and then go past the goalkeeper again. So they didn't trust him. And so Brazil played the first game with Joel, and the first game against Austria, Brazil 3-0. The second game against England was a draw, 0-0, if I remember well. And then there was a rebellion by the players. They went to Fiola and said, you have to play Garrincha. We don't care what Dr. Carvalhai says. He is unstoppable. So he came on the team against the Soviet Union at the time, and he proved to be unstoppable. There is a famous sequence you can see on video of Garrincha going past 5 or 6 Russian players, and he does it more than once. He goes past them, then he comes back. He was doing exactly what Dr. Carvalhai said it was not proper for a football player to do. He was having fun. He was playing football and that's what he always did all his life. He wouldn't know the name of his opponents. For him, all the opponents were called John. It was his way of referring to somebody who he didn't know. João, that the guy is a João, was a John. And he was like a force of nature, totally irrepressible. He played football for fun. He was fantastic. There has never been, not even Pelé, allow me to say that, there has never been in the history of the world a player like Garrincha. I saw him many times at Maracanã. I saw him destroy whole defensive teams. There is a famous photograph of a game that Botafogo played against Vasco da Gama, in which there were 7 Vasco da Gama players in line waiting for him to go past them. And he did. He went past all of them. And he would always do the same thing. He would always dribble to the outside. He would go to the side, and then he would go to the goal line and cross the ball. Everybody knew what he was going to do, and yet he kept doing it. And in 1962, when Pelé got injured, you must remember Pelé played against Mexico, then played against Czechoslovakia. He actually hit the post, then he got injured, then he couldn't play anymore. Garrincha was meant to play in the middle, like where Pelé used to play. And he also proved to be fantastic, even playing out, not in his right position. He was totally unstoppable. That's what Garrincha was. And this story is true. Dr. Carvalhai thought he was mentally deficient. And if I may add, what happened to him is that he was overplayed by Botafogo, because Botafogo needed to make money in tours around South America and Europe, and they would play Garrincha even when he couldn't play. And because of his strange malformation of his legs, he was kind of unbalanced. He developed arthrosis of the knee. So his career ended very early. When he went to England in 1966, he was not the same player anymore.
Yes, and his life off the field, we all know the stories with Elsa Soares.
He used to drink. He used to drink a lot, all that.
Yeah, but definitely a legend of the game.
And Shahan, may I mention something interesting that people usually don't know about this 1958 Brazil team, which many people say was the best ever. The center forward for this team should have been a guy called Evaristo de Macedo.
Yes, of course.
He played in the qualifiers. And actually, the story about the qualifiers is that the Brazil group was Brazil, Peru, and Venezuela. So Venezuela withdrew. So it was just Brazil and Peru. But anyway, he was the first choice as a center forward. He was a fantastic player. But what happened is that Barcelona bought him. So he went to play for Barcelona with the proviso in his contract at the time that Barcelona would release him to play in the World Cup. But what happened is that Spain didn't qualify for the World Cup. So because Spain didn't qualify for the World Cup, the matches in Spain kept going on, and they were playing the what they call Copa Generalissimo. I think today it is called Copa del Rey.
Yes.
And Barcelona refused to let him go and play for Brazil. So when Brazil was playing Sweden at the same time, same dates, he was playing for Barcelona in this Copa General. Otherwise, he would have been the center forward for Brazil, Evaristo de Macedo, neither Vavá nor Mazzola. It would have been Evaristo de Macedo, who is still alive. He's 87 years old. He lives in Rio de Janeiro.
Yes. And he briefly managed the national team in 1985 as well.
But he didn't get on with the federation big shots, and he was let go. Yes. But he was a great player.
We come to the World Cup itself. On June 8th, 1958, at Reimerswallen on Group D, Brazil took on Austria. Now, for this match, Feola chose the following lineup. Gilmar in goal from Corinthians. We mentioned De Sordi started at right back from Sao Paulo. Bellini, the captain from Vasco, and Orlando Pechania of Vasco. They formed a central defensive partnership. And Nilton Santos of Botafogo on the left back. In midfield, you have Dino Sani of Sao Paulo and Didi, who was on the right side of the midfield in this 4-2-4 formation of Botafogo. The four up the front, you have Joel of Flamengo, Mazzola or Jose Altafini of Palmeiras, Dida of Flamengo, and Zagallo of Flamengo. So as you see, there's no Pele, there's no Garrincha, and there's no Vava. For this match, Joel, Altafini, and Dida started in their place. And of course, we mentioned De Sordi is starting ahead of Jalma Santos. So the standard Brazilian formation has not taken place. And Dino Sani is also starting ahead of Zito, which should come later.
All that, if you look at this team, the only black player in this team is Gigi. All that.
Oh, yeah, I didn't notice. Yeah.
Weight to that theory.
Yeah.
But eventually Pelé came on, Djalma Santos came on, But it is not proven, but it is a very strong suspicion that's the way CBF, the Brazilian Federation, was acting at the time.
So Brazil would win this match 3-0. Altafini would score in the 37th and 80th minute, and Nilton Santos would score in the 48th minute. As far as Altafini, we should mention, at this point, he's probably more Italian than Brazilian, I would assume. He's probably lived a majority of his life in Italy.
He has. But I think he keeps ties with Brazil. I remember some time ago he was in Brazil at a ceremony in Palácio do Planalto with President Lula, when they got all the Brazilian players together for some reason. But most of his life has been spent in Italy.
Yeah, and of course, he represented Italy in the 1962 World Cup.
Exactly.
Yeah. The next match with England on June 11th at Gothenburg at Nia Ulevi. For this match, England would propose a more defensive formation to counter Brazil. Their tactic was to move Don Howe from right back to the middle, and then Eddie Clamp would move to the right back. Basically, the wing half, Billy Slater, was charged with marking Didi. So they went into it in a way playing for a tie. But let's look at this Brazil formation. You still have Gilmar in goal, De Sordi as a right back, Bellini, the captain, and Orlando Pechania, central defensive partnership, and Nilton Santos still at the left back. In midfield, Dino Sani still kept his place with Didi. The four up front, you have Joel Altafini. Vava is now in the lineup ahead of Dida and Zagallo. Also, let me quickly go through the England lineup managed by Walter Winterbottom. You have Colin McDonald of Burnley, Don Ha of West Bromwich Albion, Tom Banks of Bolton Wanderers, Eddie Clamp of Wolverhampton Wanderers, Billy Wright, captain of the team, playing for Wolverhampton Wanderers, Billy Slater, Wolverhampton Wanderers, Brian Douglas, Blackburn Rovers, Bobby Robson, future England manager, West Bromwich Albion, Derek Kevin, West Bromwich Albion, Johnny Haynes of Fulham, and Alan O'Court of Liverpool. This was a match where English goalkeeper Colin McDonald was impressive. Brazil had most of the play, most of the chances, but England playing for a tie, they were able to keep Brazil scoreless the only time during this World Cup. And the match ended as a satisfactory scoreless tie, certainly for England.
Yeah, and for Brazil, it was not bad having won the first game. Of this team, I remember very well Billy Wright, whom I knew. Later, he became a journalist for television. He was in the World Cup in 1970. Very nice person, very, very nice gentleman. And but I don't really remember many of the other players. Bobby Robinson, who became a coach, went on to be coach of various famous teams like Barcelona and like that. But it was after this game, that the Brazilian players, led by Nilton Santos from Botafogo, who knew Garrincha very well, said to Fiola, you have to bring Garrincha to the team. That's what happened.
The final group match in this Group D was on June 15th against the Soviet Union, again at Gothenburg's Nya Ullevi Stadium. So as you said, Dino Sani, Joel, and Altafini were out of the team. In for them came Zito, Pele, and Garrincha. Right now, you get the standard Brazil formation for the World Cup, obviously except Jalma Santos, who would come in the final. For this match, you have Gilmar, De Sordi, Bellini captain, Orlando Pechania, Nilton Santos, Zito of Santos now in the lineup, Didi, Garrincha, starting for the first time of Botafogo on the right wing, Vava, Pele of Santos. He would be on the 4-2-4 formation. You had Zagallo on the left, Pele inside left, Vava, and then Garrincha on the right wing.
If I may say so, this was a phony 4-4. It was called 4-4, but in reality, it was a 4-3-3 because Zagallo never in his life played as a full open outside left. He always was withdrawn outside left, always coming back to help the midfield. So Brazil was already playing 4-3-3. And this is when Brazil started to look like Brazil. Started to have the way Brazil plays and also the look of the Brazilian players. And for instance, we're talking about this thing about black players and white players. Now the black players, or what they call in Brazil, the mulatto players, the kind of mixed race players coming onto the team. Gigi, for instance, was elected, I think, if my memory serves me right, the best player of the World Cup. He was black. He was called the Ethiopian Prince by Nelson Rodrigues, a famous colonist in Brazil, because he was so elegant. He had this kind of imperial bearing. His reserve, Moacir, was also black. So this was a position where Fiola couldn't find anyone to play that would not be a black player. But this is the famous game when Garrincha came onto the team, and Vavá scores the 2 goals. If I remember well, with 2 or 3 minutes in the game, Brazil already had struck the post once. It was total domination by Brazil. Yes. And there is this famous story that the day after, because the Russians were staying, the Russian camp was near the Brazil camp. And the day after the game, the Russian players went to visit the Brazilian players in Brazil camp. And the Kuznetsov, I think Kuznetsov, I remember, the left back. There was the famous story that he finally managed to get a hold of Garrincha. Everybody laughed. You know, he came behind Garrincha and grabbed him and said, oh, that's finally he gets a hold of Garrincha, because he destroyed him in the game.
That match, like you mentioned, Vava scored in the 3rd minute and the 77th minute. Brazil won, and we're through to the quarterfinals. Let's also just quickly read through the Soviet lineup. You have Lev Yashin, Dynamo Moscow in goal, Vladimir Kezarev of Dynamo Moscow, the man you mentioned, Boris Kuznetsov of Dynamo Moscow, Yuri Voinov of Dynamo Kiev, Konstantin Kryzhevsky of Dynamo Moscow, Viktor Tsarev of Dynamo Moscow, Alexander Ivanov of Zenit Leningrad, Valentin Ivanov of Torpedo Moscow, Nikita Simonian of Spartak Moscow, Igor Neto, the captain of the side from Spartak Moscow, and Anatoly Ilin of Spartak Moscow, the side managed by Gavril Kachalin.
And there is a famous story that this guy, Igor Neto, was of Portuguese extraction.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, that's what people say, that some time before that, maybe during the Russian Revolution, his Portuguese family had immigrated to Russia.
Oh,
And
wow.
of course, you have Yashin, the Black Spider, one of the
Of
most
course.
famous goalkeepers in the history of the world.
As well as Ivanov, who'd be one of the joint top goal scorers in the 1962 World Cup, if I'm not mistaken. And obviously Nikita Simonian. This side had won the 1956 Olympics at Melbourne.
They said at the time they played a scientific football. People were expecting a lot of them.
Now we come to the quarterfinals. On June 19th, again at Gothenburg's Nia Ulevi, Brazil took on the surprising Welsh team. For this match, we have the following lineup. Gilmar in goal, De Sordi, Bellini, Orlando Pechania, Nilton Santos, Zito and Didi in midfield, Garincha. Vava did not play this match. So in his place, Mazzola came in. Mazzola Palmeiras.
Yeah.
I mean, Altafini, I should say.
Or Altafini,
yes. And Pele and Zagallo. Quickly going through the Welsh lineup, they were missing John Charles, but his brother Mel Charles was in the lineup. So you had Alfred Kelsey of Arsenal, Stuart Williams of West Bromwich Albion, Mel Hopkins of Tottenham, Derek Sullivan of Cardiff City, Mel Charles of Swansea, David Bowen of Arsenal, Terry Medvin of Tottenham, Ron Hewitt of Cardiff, Colin Webster of Manchester United, Ivor Allchurch of Swansea, and Cliff Jones of Tottenham, in a side managed by Jimmy Murphy.
This was, as far as I remember, the only time in the World Cup that you had 4 British teams playing the World Cup: England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales.
Yes, all the home countries, first time, yeah.
All the 4 so-called home countries,
Yeah.
First and only time.
Yeah.
Yes. For this match, Hopkins was charged with neutralizing Garincha. It was a tough match for Brazil. As far as Altafini, this would be his very last cap for Brazil. The goal is very famous. Pele scored a winning goal for Brazil, and he considers this the most important goal of his career. I'm sure we've all seen the video footage where he gets a pass, he traps it with his chest, with his goal to the back, turns around, and shoots past Kelsey. It was obviously a very famous goal. It was his first goal of his World Cup career and set Brazil to the semifinals. But it was a tough match, and it was not an easy win for Brazil.
No, it was very difficult. The way that the British teams, they can be difficult. They can sometimes totally flounder, but when they play well, they are difficult side. Any of these so-called home teams for the Great Britain, they can be difficult. It was a difficult game, and it was a totally individual play by Pelé. As you said, I think it was Didi who passed the ball to him. He had his back to the goal. He kind of almost with the ball over the top of the head of the guy here, who was supposed to be marking him. And if I remember well, actually, when Pelé takes the shot, when he shoots, the ball hits one of the defenders for Wales, but it still goes into the goal. But it was a very difficult game, no doubt. And of course, I agree with Pelé. The most important goal he ever scored was the only goal in a very difficult game, and it was the quarterfinal. Brazil had to win the game.
Now we come to the semifinal. On June 24th at Stockholm, Brazil are facing another revelation for this World Cup, the French team of Raymond Kopa and Just Fontaine, who had been scoring freely during this World Cup. For this match, you have Gilmar, De Sordi, starting for the last time during the World Cup, Bellini and Pechania in central defense. Orlando Pechania. Nilton Santos on left back. Zito and Didi in midfield. And you have Garincha, Vava, Pele, and Zagallo up front. For France, you have the following lineup. Claude Abbes of Saint-Etienne, Raymond Kelbel of Monaco, André Laurent of Lyon, Armand Penvert of Reims, Robert Jonquet, captain of the team from Reims, Jean-Jacques Marcel of Olympique Marseille, Marian Wisniewski of Racing Lens, Raymond Kopa of Real Madrid, the Napoleon of football, Just Fontaine, the top goal scorer of this World Cup with 13 goals eventually, of Reims, Roger Piantoni of Reims, and Jean Vincent of Reims. The side manager Albert Batter. For this match, Brazil quickly took the lead through Vava in the second minute. The French tied the match in the 9th minute through Just Fontaine. But a key event in this match, the French captain and defender, Robert Jonquet, was injured in the 37th minute after a collision with Vava. After a few minutes, he would have to leave the field. As we mentioned back then, there were no substitutions. So France had to play with 10 men. Just a couple of minutes after Jonquet's injury, Didi scored a beautiful long-range shot to the top corner of the goal. So Brazil took a 2-1 halftime lead. In the second half, playing with one extra man, Brazil just took France apart. Pelé scored 3 times in the 53rd, 64th, and 76th minute. In the 53rd minute, basically the French goalkeeper tried to block a cross. It just fell in front of Pelé. He just tapped it in. 4th and 5th goals in the 64th and the 76th minutes were crosses by Garrincha from the right side, and Pelé just volleyed the 2 goals. France pulled the goal back by Roger Piantoni in the 83rd minute, but Brazil were through to the final with a 5-2 win.
Yeah, it was no contest because, as you said, Jonquet was injured, and it is a pity, but that's how life it was. As I mentioned before, in 1962, the same thing happened to Pelé in the game against Czechoslovakia in the World Cup in Chile. He had already hit the post. He got injured. Then he had to stay on the pitch. He stayed on the pitch playing on the right side as an outside right. And Garrincha went to the middle to play in his position. And Pelé was just watching, a bystander. And the same thing happened to France in 58 against Brazil because of Jonquet. And France also had a very, you mentioned Just Fontaine, also had a very famous player, Raymond Kopa, outside right, who used to play for Real Madrid. It is funny because he could go, Real Madrid was also involved in the Copa Generalissimo in Spain, but the Copa was allowed by Real Madrid to go and play for France in the World Cup, whereas Barcelona wouldn't let Evaristo de Macedo go and play for Brazil. And the interesting story about Evaristo de Macedo is that later on he went on to play for Real Madrid. And you know the big rivalry between Barcelona and Real Madrid, but he became a dear player. You know, everybody likes him for Barcelona, but also for Real Madrid. He was very respected as a Real Madrid player.
As far as Copa, I'm just thinking because Real Madrid had already won the Champions Cup, perhaps that was enough.
They let Copa go for France.
Yeah. We come to the final on June 29th. Brazil are playing at Stockholm against the host nation, Sweden. Sweden, who had eliminated West Germany, the defending champions, in the semifinals. For this match, you have Gilmar starting in goal, Djalma Santos starting for the first and only time during this World Cup.
And after that, he would always be first choice.
Yes. So
never was any doubt in anybody's mind that he was first choice as a right back.
So Djalma Santos are Portuguesa in the lineup. Now, do you know the reason why De Sordi was taken out for the final if he had played all the other matches?
I don't know whether it was a tactical reason. I suspect it was a tactical reason because even though De Sordi was a useful player, very, very few people would doubt that Djalma Santos was a better player. So for me, it was a mystery. Why not Djalma Santos was not playing before? That was what was strange. Not that Djalma Santos came on finally in the last match. Is why didn't he play before? But he played against Sweden and he played very well. He was supposed to mark Skoglund, Naka Skoglund.
Yes.
If I remember the name well.
Leonard,
the left winger for Sweden, and he did an excellent job.
In the central defense, you still have Bellini, the captain of the side, from Vasco da Gama, and Orlando Pechania of Vasco da Gama. Left back, you have Nilton Santos of Botafogo. In midfield, you have Zito of Santos and Didi of Botafogo. Up front, right wing, Garrincha of Botafogo. Vava, inside right, of Vasco da Gama. Pele, inside left of Santos. And on the left wing, or as you say, fluctuating left wing, Mario Zagallo of Flamengo. For Sweden, you have the following lineup. Carl Svensson of Helsingborg, Orvar Bergmark of Örebro, Sven Axbom of IFK Norrköping, Rino Borgesson of Norrby, Bengt Gustafsson of Atalanta in Italy, Sigvard Parling of Djurgårdens, Kurt Hamrin of Padova in Italy. He had also played at Fiorentina. Gunnar Gren of Örgryte. He had been part of the famous Swedish Granoli trio for AC Milan in most of the 50s. But now he was back to the Swedish league for Örgryte. Agnes Simonsson of Örgryte. Niels Lidholm of AC Milan. We all know, later became a very good manager and managed AC Milan and AS Roma to the Scudetto in Italy. And Lennart Skoglund of Internazionale Milano in Italy.
Yeah, this is the player I mentioned that Djalma Santos was supposed to mark, and he did mark him very well. If I remember well, his nickname was Naka. Lennart Skoglund, nickname Naka Skoglund.
For this match, Lidholm would give Sweden the lead in the 4th minute. It only took 5 minutes before Brazil tied the match. Garrincha on the right wing crossed, and Vava scored from the center to give Brazil a tie. In the 32nd minute, a near identical move. Garrincha crossed from the right, and then Vava tapping in from the center. Going into the second half, Brazil had a 2-1 lead. Second half, 55th minute, Pele scores the very famous goal that we've all seen, where he gets across, he traps it, he lobs it over an onrushing defender, and then volleys it with his left foot. So Brazil are 3-1 ahead. In the 68th minute, Mario Zagallo slides in a 4th goal from the left. In the 80th minute, Simonsson pulls a goal back for Sweden. But Brazil wrapped up the match in the 90th minute with Pele scoring a header in the 90th minute. Again, it's a goal that's been replayed many, many times. There's a cross from the left. He just heads it and just slightly hits the post before going in.
Yeah, and the cross, if I remember well, was from Zagallo.
Yes, from the left side, yes.
Yeah.
So Brazil were champions for the first time in their World Cup history. In doing so, they exercised the ghost of 1950. They became the first nation from a different continent to win the World Cup. At 17 years of age, Pele became, at the time, he was the youngest player in the World Cup history. I guess until Norman Whiteside in 1982. I'm not sure which one was, I know they were both 17, but I'm not sure which one was younger age-wise.
Yeah, but anyway, he was the world champion.
Exactly, yeah.
Player who was world champion at that age. He had started to play for Brazil at 16. And one of the big regrets of Maradona's life was that Maradona could have also been a 17-year-old world champion in 1917, but at the last moment, Cesar Luis Menotti let him go. So he was not in
Yes, Menotti believed that the pressure would have been too much for a 17, 18-year-old at the time.
The way Maradona was a bit like Garrincha. No pressure would be big for Maradona. But talk about this Pelé goal that you mentioned, that he scored one of the goals with the left foot, was that Pelé was a complete player. Pelé could score with the right foot, the left foot, with the head, even though he was not tall. He was fantastic.
So let's discuss Brazil's return to the mainland. They have a stopover at Recife. And then from there, they fly to Rio. French reporter Jean-Philippe Retaker, who has written for L'Équipe and France Football. He was in place and he discussed just the pandemonium with Brazil's...
He was in Rio? Did you say he was in Rio?
Yes. That was his report from. Yeah, he was in place and he reported it.
Yeah, what was his name?
Jean-Philippe Retaker.
Okay.
He wrote for L'Équipe and France Football back then. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember the name.
Yeah. He said the celebrations that he witnessed would have been unimaginable in Europe. He said there were maybe 1 million people at Rio to welcome the team back. He mentioned that the Brazilian plane was escorted by 16 military jets to land in Rio. And Bellini was the first one to come out of a plane holding the World Cup. The Brazilian vice president, João Goulart, greeted the team. And from there on, it took nearly 3 hours to reach the city center with, like I said, all the carnival atmosphere and the celebration all along the way. In the aftermath of the World Cup win, I read reports that each player got a house, a TV set, 578,000 cruceros. A Sao Paulo industrialist gave Pele a Jeep, among other things. So it just shows how important this win was for Brazil. It shows that what they went through in 1950, that this was just such a release of emotions, that they had finally won the World Cup. And 1950 was resigned to history, so to speak. As someone who was there, how do you remember this?
Yeah, I don't know whether there were 1 million people, but I was one of them anyway. I went to the city center, to Avenida Rio Branco, one of the main thoroughfares in Rio de Janeiro, and the players were parading top trucks and things like that. It was a release of that, of the emotions of the 1950 World Cup, was the biggest disappointment you can imagine. In 1950, there were more than 200,000 people at Maracanã because they were certain that Brazil would win the World Cup. I didn't go. My father, I was 13 years old at the time. My father didn't let me go because he thought it was going to be too dangerous. And in fact, it was, because people just broke the entrance, the gates for the stadium, and people know there were more than 200,000 people, but it has never been ascertained exactly how many people were inside Maracanã that day. And then in 1954, it was also another disappointment in the famous Battle of Bern, when Brazil lost to Hungary, was eliminated, was knocked out by Hungary. And so all this was weigh very heavily on the Brazilian soul, and it was the opportunity to release all that emotion and to prove that, contrary to what famous writer Nelson Rodrigues said at the time, Brazil didn't have a mongrel soul. You know, they had the personality to win in Europe. Yes. You have to realize that Brazil is, and it was more at that time, one of a third world country. And it was a third world country proving to the Europeans that they could go there in their continent and beat them. So it was a big release of emotion it was kind of a bit silly in a way, kind of infantile, but that was how the Brazilian soul was at the time. They needed that to feel big, to feel important in the eyes of the world. And that was the beginning of a whole series of wins for Brazil in the World Cup. Then they would win again in 1962. They would win again in 1970, in 1994, 2002, and all that. And up to today, football or soccer is very important in Brazil. Maybe not as much as it was before. At that time, soccer was all-consuming. Everybody would be totally devoted to following the Brazil national team. Now there are people who say, they lost in the World Cup. I don't care, or the more important things in life. But that time, that was the important thing, to win the World Cup.
Just to put things in perspective, for the generation of myself and Paul, we've basically been born into a world where Brazilian football is considered the apex. And it's hard to imagine that this is where it started. Brazilian football is, or the national team at least, is the central talking point of football. And in a way is everyone's favorite other team in a World Cup.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that for me, not so much anymore. There was a time that Brazil really was that. And as you said, Brazil was everybody else's second team because of the way they played. But now I don't think Brazil is Brazil anymore. It's not the same level. It's not respected as much as it was, and rightly so, because, when you look at what has been going on with Brazil since the World Cup in 2002, when they won, and after that, it has been lots of disappointment after disappointment, especially in 2014, playing at home and being beaten 7-1 by Germany, and then losing again for the third place against the Netherlands, and going to Russia, also that, disappointment against Belgium. And I don't think Brazil is as respected now as a footballing power as it was before. And another thing is, when you look at coaches, there are no important Brazilian coaches anymore. You look at coaches in Europe, they have coaches that go from Argentina, from Chile, from Portugal, they go to England, they go to Germany, Spanish coaches, Portuguese coaches, French coaches, Argentinian, Uruguayan coaches. Where are the Brazilian coaches? They are not sought out by important football clubs in the world anymore. I think Brazil is at a low point in his history of football. And maybe let's see what happens in Qatar. But right now, Brazil is not as good as it used to be.
And just looking back at this 1958 tournament, ahead of this, would you say that it was expected from the public and the press that Brazil would win, or was it, bearing in mind that it was in Europe and that what happened in 1950, was this a little bit of a surprise, or would you say it was an expected win?
I don't think people were expecting Brazil to win. They were hoping Brazil would do reasonably well, but I don't really think people were. That's why it was such a release of emotion when Brazil finally won, finally proved that they were good at football. It was all a kind of everything came together at the same time. Important players came up to the team like Garrincha and Pelé. If we didn't have Garrincha and if we didn't have Pelé, probably wouldn't have won that World Cup. They just happened to be there at that time. And luckily, a little bit because of the pressure of the players themselves, they were brought onto the team, especially Garrincha. Pelé was not playing in the beginning because he was injured, but Garrincha was a different story. He was not playing in the beginning because, as I said, the team psychologist thought that he was mentally deficient, and he wasn't. He was a great player.
As far as tactical innovations, Brazil's victory popularized this 4-2-4 formation. Was this planned ahead of the World Cup, or was it developed after the team took shape with additions of Pelé and Garrincha?
No, as I said, Brazil didn't. I don't know why people used to say at the time that Brazil was playing. There was a Brazilian coach called Martin Francisco, who was a kind of an intellectual. And he was supposed to have developed this 4-2-4 system in Brazilian football. And maybe because of that, people said, oh, Brazil played 4-2-4. In fact, they didn't. As I said, they were already playing 4-3-3 because Zagallo, by nature, Brazil had two left wingers at that time, Zagallo and Pepe for Santos. Pepe was an attacking left winger, and Zagallo was a withdrawn left winger. So Zagallo, by nature, would make Brazil play 4-3-3. So when people say that Brazil was playing 4-2-2, it's not true. Brazil was already playing 4-3-3. And maybe that's why they won the World Cup, because Zagallo played a very important role in that team by helping the midfield coming back. Today, players are supposed to both attack and defend, right? The moment you lose the ball, you have try to recover the ball, and gegen pressing. You have to be constant pressing. You need a lot of stamina, endurance, good physical conditioning for that. At the time, it was different. And also another thing that I'd like to mention is that when people today, they compare players of different generation, it is not very fair because everything was different. The ball was heavier. The boots were not as good as they are today. Even the shirts were heavier. They were not like these very nice shirts that absorb sweat like they have yesterday. The condition of the pitch was not as good. So everything was more difficult. And I remember Zagallo saying that when he used to play at that time, the boots were not good and he would have to wear 2 socks and still put a kind of a protection inside the boot in order not to get hurt, because the condition, the material was not as good as it is today. So it is, I think, very difficult to make comparisons when people say, oh, Maradona was better than Pelé or Messi is better than Maradona. You cannot make comparisons like that.
Another question about the style of the team and a possible influence on that. I have read that the famous Hungarian coach Bela Gutmann, he'd worked in Sao Paulo, I think the year before this World Cup, and I believe Viola was his assistant at the time, and that this had maybe also influenced the style or the tactics of this team. Do you think there's any truth in that?
I think it is quite possible. There was Bela Gutmann. There was another famous Hungarian coach that coached for Flamengo. I don't remember his name right now. And he was coaching for Flamengo at the time that Flávio Costa, who became the Brazil coach in 1950, was at Flamengo, and Flávio Costa was his assistant. So it's important to say that there was, at that time, and there were important coaches from Europe that would go to Brazil and would influence because Brazil being far, nowadays it's very easy. Everybody travels by plane all the time, But in those times, the interchange between different continents was not as frequent as it is now. So Brazil was kind of out on a branch, and Brazil was not very up to date. They say it took a long time for Brazil to adopt to the new offside law, the WM and all that. So it is important to say that it's quite possible that Bela Gutmann, who was a coach for São Paulo, had a very big influence in the way Vicente Viola used to think about football.
How do you compare this 1958 team with the 1970 squad?
Individually, maybe they were better, but as I say, it is very difficult to compare players of different generations because of the conditions. But, in 1970, you didn't have anybody like Garrincha. You had Jairzinho, but he was not as good as Garrincha. You had Pelé, of course, but you didn't have important players like Nilton Santos, the left fullback, Carlos Alberto, I would say, and Djalma Santos were at the same level. But players like Gigi, maybe if you go player by the goalkeeper, Gilmar, was better than Felix in the 1970 World Cup. Bellini was not maybe as a fantastic player from the technical point of view, but he was a leader. He was the captain of that team. There is a statue of Bellini still today at Maracanã Stadium in Rio de Janeiro. He was an inspiration for that team. So if you take all that into consideration, maybe the 1958 team was better than the 1970 team.
And the teams that we associate so much with Brazilian football, from having seen the footage, obviously 1970, because there's coloured TV footage of that. And the 1982 team is the other team that was both myself and Sean personally, that was probably the first team that really got us into football in the same way. They were such a fantastic team. And how would you say that the 1958 team is viewed culturally and how it's still seen in Brazil, given how famous the teams that have come since and that there wasn't the same coverage of them at the time?
Well, I think the 1958 team, as I said, is up there. Of course, many years have passed. There are very few people now who have, at that time, who were watching football as I was at that time. You mentioned, I would say that maybe you mentioned three of the most famous teams in Brazilian football, 1958, 1970, and 1982. But the difference is that in 1982, of course, it was an unhappy ending for Brazil. Many things happened. Talking about 1958, I said that Evaristo de Macedo probably was going to be the Brazil center forward, but he was playing for Barcelona, so he couldn't go. In 1982, you had two center forwards, Reynaldo and Carrick. Both were injured at the time. And so Tele Santana had to go with
Serginho,
exactly.
Yes.
Serginho Chulapa. I was thinking about his nickname. And as people said, he was a different kind of player. He played more of a square ball, and the other were playing with a round ball. And the fact is that Brazil went into that game against Italy. It was a game that Brazil was the heavy favorite. They should have won. Everything went wrong that day. 3 silly goals, really, especially the first and the third, and Brazil was knocked out of the World Cup. But people still remember that as a great team. No doubt about that. After that, Brazil won in 1994, Brazil won again in 2002, but those teams are not as much of a reference to Brazilian football as the teams we have talked, 58, 70, and 82.
Now let's take a look at the 1958 players. You have De Sordi, who started the World Cup at the right back. He would gain 3 more caps until 1961. His first cap had been 1955. He passed away on August 24th, 2013. Just a day before Gilmar passed away on August 25th, 2013. So Gilmar would be Brazilian goalkeeper until 1966. He also gained 1 last cap in 1969 versus England. He was first capped in 1953.
Yeah, that was just because it was his farewell game.
Yes.
He was brought onto that team just because he was retiring.
Djalma Santos would also remain until 1966. He would gain 1 last cap in 1968, aged 39. And he was first capped in 1952. He passed away on July 23rd, 2013. So we come to the captain, Bellini. He remained until the 1966 World Cup, but he did not play in the 1962 World Cup. He passed away on March 20th, 2014. His central defensive partner, Orlando Pechania, he also remained until the 1966 World Cup, although he did not play in the 1962 World Cup. His first cap had been that same year against Bulgaria, 1958. He passed away on February 10, 2010. Nilton Santos remained until the 1962 World Cup, was part of that winning team. He had been first capped in 1949, so he had almost a decade in the national team by the time of this World Cup. And he passed away on November 27, 2013. Zito, he also remained until 1966, though he did not play in the World Cup of 1966. He passed away on June 14, 2015. Didi also remained in the national team until 1962 and was member of the 1962 World Cup winning side. We mentioned he did join Real Madrid, but it's a very known story that Alfredo Di Stefano did not take too kindly to his arrival and in a way froze him out of the team. And his stay at Real Madrid was very short. He passed away on May 12, 2001. Garrincha, we mentioned before, all his off-field problems. He remained until the 1966 World Cup, but by then he was clearly past his best. Sadly, he would pass away on January 20th, 1983, only age 49, I believe, due to alcoholism-related illness. Vava remained in the national team until 1964. I believe he played at Atletico Madrid, if I'm not mistaken, at some point.
Yes, yeah.
And
he did.
Yeah, he passed away on January 19th, 2002. Pele, well, we know everything about him. He remained with the national team until 1971.
He's 80 years old now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mario Zagallo. He remained until 1964. He became the first man to manage and win a World Cup when he managed the 1970 World Cup. As late as 1998, he was managing the national team in a World Cup final. A legend for Brazilian football.
No, I was going to say that Zagallo is a very important name in the history of football. I remember when I was working for ESPN here in the United States, once I heard one of my colleagues from a different country make a glowing reference to Franz Beckenbauer and said, the only guy who won the World Cup as a coach and as a player. I said, excuse me, Zagallo won the World Cup as a player 1958, 1962. He won as a manager in 1970. He won as an assistant manager in 1994. He was in 1998, he took Brazil to the World Cup final. So there's nobody in the history of the world that has such an illustrious career in football than Zagallo as coach, and he's still alive,
Right.
But you have to respect, he's a very controversial person, even in Brazil. But you have to respect that this guy has a fantastic history in football. People usually don't remember that.
The correct way would have been that Beckenbauer was the first captain and manager to win the World Cup.
Yeah, but not player. Yeah.
Yes. We mentioned about Jose Altafini, who later joined the Italian league for many years with AC Milan, Napoli, Juventus. He would gain 6 caps for the Italian national team. You have Vicente Feola, the manager. He did not manage for the 1962 World Cup, but he was back for the 1966 World Cup.
Which was a total disaster.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
He passed away on November 6, 1975. Dino Sani, who would also join AC Milan later on, his last cap was in 1966, but although he did not play in the World Cup as well. Joel Antonio Martins, he earned the last cap in 1961 versus Paraguay. He passed away on New Year's Day 2003. Dida, he would gain 2 more caps, one in 1960 and one in 1961. He passed away on September 17th, 2002. Now we come to the 6 players who did not see any action during this World Cup. You have the backup goalkeeper, Carlos José de Castillo. He would gain cap in 1962, but did not play in the World Cup as well.
He played in 1954, Castillo.
Yes.
He was the Brazilian goalkeeper in 54, yeah.
Yes. Oreco, his last cap was against Paraguay in 1961. He passed away on April 3rd, 1985. You have Zozimo. Zozimo did not see any action during this World Cup, but he would form with Mauro the central defensive partnership for the 1962 World Cup winning team. When I said earlier that the 1962 team was virtually the same as 1958, let's leave aside the whole Pele being replaced by Amarildo. All the other players were the same except the central defensive partnership. Bellini and Orlando Pechania were out by 1962. They were replaced by Zozimo and Mauro, who actually captained the side for 1962. But getting back to Zozimo, so he would be a starter and his last cap would be in 1962. He passed away on July 17th, 1977, age just 45. Of the players of this group, he was the first one to pass away. So then you have Moacir. He gained 1 last cap in 1960 versus Argentina. I believe he's still alive. And we mentioned Mauro, who formed with Zozimo the central defensive partnership for the 1962 World Cup. His last cap would be 1965. He passed away on September 18, 2002. Finally, we come to Pepe, who is still alive, and his last cap was in 1963. It's a very balanced side, a lot of good players, and just the fact that someone like Zosimo or Mauro can get into this team just as what a quality team this was.
I think the 1962 team was not as good as the 1958. Of course, Pelé only played one game, full game, and about 10 minutes of the other game. Then he remained on the pitch, but not really playing. And you mentioned Amarildo. Amarildo was important in 1962, coming on for Pelé, which was not very easy to do, you know. A lot of expectation, and he played well, and he went on to play in Italy as well. Another Brazilian
AC
player.
Milan, yes.
Yeah, AC Milan, yeah.
Yes.
But you are making me feel very old because of all these people who have died. But anyway.
You have witnessed history that's something that most of us have just read. So you're in a very unique position to have actually worked in the field, to have seen all this, and just hearing you say that I watched Pele's first match for Brazil. I mean, that's unbelievable.
At that time, I was not even a journalist. I only started working in journals, in newspapers in 1962, after the World Cup in Chile. So I used to watch all these games as a fan, not as a professional journalist. Eventually, I became a professional observer of the game. But nowadays, it is very easy to follow football all over the world. Like today's, for instance, they are going to show Liverpool and Manchester. I'm going to watch it. I'm in the United States, and I'm going to watch it. And in 1958, in 1962, they didn't have things. In 1962, they had a videotape. You could watch the game in Brazil play in Chile. You could watch the game the day after. In 1958, there was no television. 1970 was the first time that television showed the World Cup worldwide. But, it's a very different, times are very different.
And probably this 1970, I'm sure it was probably in black and white, even though it was probably...
No, in Brazil, it was the first time they showed it in color, actually.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
It was shown in color in Brazil. And I was there in 1970. I was in 1966 in England for the World Cup. And I was in 1970 in Mexico I was in Guadalajara, with Brazil. At the time, I was covering the England team. And because Brazil and England were both in Guadalajara, I was there for all the games that Brazil played. The only game I wasn't there when Brazil played was the game Brazil and Peru, because I was in León. Was it León? When England and West Germany played.
Yes, that was in León, I believe. Yeah.
León, yeah. And West Germany won in extra time, 3-2, with the Gerd Müller goal. England was leading this 2-0, I think.
Yes.
Done nothing, and they managed to. Alf Ramsey took out Bobby Charlton, thinking I'm going to spare him for the next game. And the end result is that they lost. I was there. Yeah.
Yes, that's the match where, the England scapegoat has always been the late goalkeeper Peter Bonetti, who started ahead of Gordon Banks.
Well, you have the famous story that Gordon Banks drank a beer that made him sick the day before the game. Nobody knows exactly what was in that beer, but he couldn't play.
Any final thoughts, Paul, of this wonderful team?
As you say, it's fantastic to have this history brought to life by someone who was there at the time, and having seen these players, it's a real privilege to hear those memories, and thank you for sharing them with us. It's been great.
Well, it was my pleasure.
Once again, we would like to thank Mr. Werneck for his participation in this interview. As always, feel free to leave questions and comments. For any questions and comments, you may contact us. You may contact me on my blog and Facebook under Soccer Nostalgia. On Twitter, I'm at SP1873. Mr. Paul Whittle can be contacted on his blog, The 1888 Letter, or on Twitter at 1888 Letter. You may also follow the podcast on Spotify under Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. Mr. Werneck's contact info on Twitter, he can be contacted at Werneck Inácio and at Brasil Copa 70. And his blog is blogcamponeutro.com. And all this information is listed on the blog and Spotify listing. Mr. José Inácio, thanks again. It's been a privilege.
Very welcome. It was a pleasure.
You and relive your memories.
Thank to you and to Paul. Thank you.
Thank you.